In the winter of 1944, a German reconnaissance plane photographed an entire American armored division massing near the front. Hundreds of tanks, trucks, heavy artillery. The ground itself seemed to rumble. The German command did the only sensible thing. They pulled forces across the line to meet it. There was just one problem. That division wasn't real. The tanks were made of rubber. 4 men could lift one, and the thunder of all those engines was a recording played through speakers the size of a piano. One of the men standing in that field would carry what really happened there for the rest of his life. Decades later, in a quiet American living room, he still wouldn't be able to tell his own family what he did in this war. Hold on to that, because what these men were hiding wasn't shameful. It was one of the most brilliant ideas of the entire war. This is the story of 1,100 men who won battles without firing a shot and were erased from history for doing it. To understand how this happened, start with one of them. His name was Victor Dowd. Before the war, he was a young artist from New York, the kind of man who could sketch anything he saw in a few quick strokes. When Dowd was drafted, he assumed he'd be handed a rifle like everyone else. Instead, the army handed him a rifle and a sketch pad, and assigned him to a unit with a name designed to mean nothing: the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. What that bland name hid was the first tactical deception unit in American history. An army whose only weapon was the lie. Their entire job was to impersonate other units, to make 20 men look like 20,000, to appear exactly where the real army wasn't, and to pull the enemy toward a battle that would never come. Here is what most people get wrong about World War II. We picture it as a war of brute force, bigger guns, more steel, more men, and it was. But running underneath all of it was a second, quieter war, a war over what the enemy believed. And the Americans built an entire secret unit full of men like Dowd to fight it. Which raises the obvious question: if you are building an army of liars, who do you recruit? The answer is the strangest part of this whole story. When the army went looking for soldiers to fight a war of illusion, it didn't go to the usual places. It went to art schools, advertising agencies, design studios. The Ghost Army filled its ranks with painters, illustrators, set designers, sound engineers, and architects. Men who had spent their civilian lives making fake things look real, and were now going to do it under fire. Some of them would become legends after the war. Bill Blass, who became one of America's most famous fashion designers. Ellsworth Kelly, a giant of modern art. Art Kane, a celebrated photographer. In 1944, they were inflating rubber tanks and painting fake insignia a few miles from German guns. And because they were artists, Dowd and the others did something no ordinary soldier would. In the middle of a war, they kept drawing. They sketched the villages, the ruins, the men beside them. Thousands of those drawings survived. And remember that, because those sketchbooks will matter enormously by the end of this story. But don't picture a harmless group of creatives playing dress-up. They worked within range of enemy artillery. They were lightly armed. If the Germans ever called the bluff and attacked in force, there was almost nothing these men could do but run or die. So how do 1,000 artists fool entire German divisions? It started with the thing everyone remembers: the rubber. The Ghost Army's most famous weapon was inflatable. Rubber tanks, rubber trucks, rubber artillery, and even rubber aircraft. From a few hundred yards, or from a plane thousands of feet up, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. A full-size dummy Sherman weighed almost nothing. A handful of men could carry it, place it, and inflate it in minutes. A field empty at dusk could hold 100 tanks by dawn. But men like Dowd understood something the engineers couldn't fake on their own. Realism lives in the details. A real tank leaves tracks in the mud, so they faked the tracks. A real camp has worn paths, garbage, laundry drying in the wind, so they staged all of it. And here is the genius part. They made deliberate mistakes. A gun barrel left poking out from under a camouflage net just a little too far. A vehicle carelessly parked in the open, because they knew enemy photo analysts were trained to find what an army tried to hide. So the Ghost Army handed them exactly that and let them feel clever for spotting it. But here is the flaw in a rubber army. It is completely silent. And a real armored division is the loudest thing on Earth. That gap nearly exposed them, so they solved it with something no one had ever tried. You can fake what an army looks like, but the enemy doesn't only watch, they listen. A tank division is a wall of noise, engines, treads, shouted orders, bridges being built. Silence from a division would give the entire game away. So the army turned to one of the most advanced audio operations of the war. Engineers recorded the real sounds of armored and infantry units. Tanks rolling, bridges assembling, men working. They took those recordings to specialists at Bell Labs, who blended them into seamless soundtracks of an army on the move, mixed for whatever story they needed to tell that night. Then they mounted enormous speakers, driven by amplifiers powerful enough to be heard up to 15 miles away, onto half-tracks. After dark, these vehicles crept toward the front and played the sound of a phantom army gathering in the night. To German soldiers in their trenches, it was unmistakable. Tanks were massing. An attack was coming, right here. It was, quite literally, a war fought with a soundtrack. Sound engineers near the front line, conducting an invisible orchestra of an army that existed only on tape. Now they could fake an army's body and its voice. But there was one last thing to counterfeit, and it was the strangest of all. They had to fake the army's mind. Modern armies are held together by radio, and both sides were always listening in. So the Ghost Army built a third weapon, the airwaves. Their radio operators studied the real units they impersonated, right down to the personal fist, the unique rhythm each operator had when tapping out Morse code. Then they copied it exactly. Broadcasting invented traffic, so German eavesdroppers heard a familiar division sitting precisely where it was supposed to be. The imposters were so good, the enemy couldn't tell them from the originals. And then there was the part that sounds like fiction. They called it atmosphere. Small teams would drive into nearby towns wearing the insignia of the unit they were faking. Wrong shoulder patches, sewn on deliberately. False markings painted on their jeeps. A few even impersonated generals, sitting in cafes where they knew enemy informants were watching, loudly letting slip troop movements that were completely invented. They were actors performing for an audience of one, the enemy, who never knew he was watching a performance and whose decisions depended on believing every second of it. For months, the act held. Then came the assignment that put everything and everyone, including Dowd, at risk in a single night. March 1945. The Allies were about to cross the Rhine, the last great natural barrier guarding Germany itself. The real crossing point had to stay secret, or the Germans would throw everything they had at it. So the Ghost Army drew its most dangerous assignment of the war. Near a town called Viersen, roughly 1,000 men would impersonate 2 entire divisions, about 30,000 troops. To convince the Germans the crossing would come there, miles from the real site. This was everything they had, all at once. Hundreds of dummy vehicles, sonic units roaring the sound of an army around the clock, fake radio nets crackling with phantom orders, even real artillery firing from their positions to sell the illusion. They built a 30,000-man army out of barely 1,000 men and a warehouse of tricks. And this time, the deception worked too well. The Germans shelled the area, believing they were hitting a massive force, which meant Dowd and the others sat inside their own illusion under live artillery fire, holding the lie together while the shells came down. It worked. German attention stayed locked on Viersen, and when the real crossing came, miles away, it met far lighter resistance than it should have. Historians believe the deception saved thousands of lives that day. It was one of the most successful deceptions of the entire war. So why did almost no one ever hear about it? That's where this story takes its strangest turn. Across roughly 24 operations from Normandy to the Rhine, the Ghost Army impersonated unit after unit, and by some estimates, helped save tens of thousands of lives. Man for man, it was one of the most effective units of the war. And the moment the war ended, it vanished. The men were ordered to say nothing, not to their friends, not to their families. Tactical deception was considered too valuable to reveal. The army wanted to reuse these tricks in future wars, which meant the Ghost Army had to stay a ghost. So men like Victor Dowd went home and lived ordinary lives, carrying one of the great secrets of the war in silence. This is the man from the opening, the one who, decades later, still couldn't fully explain to his own family what he'd done. Some of these men died before they were ever allowed to tell their children. Wives never knew. The records stayed sealed. Officially, for 40 years, the unit had never existed. But the truth had survived in a place the army never thought to classify, and that's exactly how it finally came out. The records were declassified in 1996, and the story came back to life, not through official files, but through those sketchbooks. The drawings Dowd and the other artists made in the field became one of the clearest records we have of what the Ghost Army actually did. The men, ordered to erase themselves, had, without meaning to, kept the evidence the whole time, in pencil. The world learned that some of the most famous artists and designers of the 20th century had once won battles with rubber and sound. And in 2022, nearly 80 years after the war, the United States Congress awarded the Ghost Army its highest honor, the Congressional Gold Medal. By the time it came, only a handful of them were still alive to receive it. They spent the war making sure no one would ever know they were there. They were so good at vanishing that history nearly let them vanish for good. But they were real. 1,100 men who proved that in war, the deadliest weapon isn't always the one that fires. Sometimes, it's the one that makes the enemy believe. If this is the history they leave out of the textbooks, the buried, the classified, the erased, then you're in the right place. This is Blacksite History. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.